introduce the event. I'm just going to give a quick disclaimer about the event before we start. We're the Georgetown MENA Forum. That's myself, Andrew Hanna, and Mohammed Soliman. We're organizing this in partnership with the Institute for Palestinian Studies, and we're here to bring different voices on campus so that we can hear and discuss and have a robust dialogue. That does not mean we necessarily endorse the views of speakers. We just present them for you to make judgments and ask your own questions and think a little bit deeper about these issues. And with that, I'll turn it over.
Okay. So on behalf of the Institute for Palestine Studies and with our co-organizing partner, the MENA Forum, I want to welcome everyone and thank you all for being at today's event, along with the people joining us on our live stream through Facebook. My name is Stephen Bennett. I work at the Institute for Palestine Studies. I handle marketing development. So before we begin today's event and what I'm sure will be a highly interesting conversation, I want to take a minute to introduce IPS, the Institute for Palestine Studies, for those of you who might not be aware of us and what we do, and to briefly talk about our knowledge products. IPS has been, for decades, the top institution for research, analysis, and information regarding all aspects of the question of Palestine. IPS was founded in 1963 in Beirut, Lebanon, as a fully independent, nonprofit research institute. In addition to our Beirut office, which also houses the largest collection of Palestine-focused books and materials in the world, we also have an office in Ramallah in the West Bank and here in Washington, D.C. We actually happen to be in the Georgetown neighborhood on M Street, if you're not aware of us. IPS fosters original and innovative inquiry, research, and discussion through our quarterly journals, those being the Journal of Palestine Studies in Arabic and English, and Jerusalem Quarterly. Jerusalem Quarterly, also known as JQ, is the only journal focused specifically on the city of Jerusalem, its social history, its status, its culture, and political status. The Journal of Palestine Studies, JPS, is the journal of record on Palestinian affairs. It unites sound research, timely analysis, and it provides thought-provoking articles, essays, interviews, book reviews, and special features. I want everyone to keep an eye out for issue number 192, which is going to focus on formations of Black Palestinian transnational solidarities, featuring some work from Noura, who is on our editorial committee. We also organize workshops, seminars, conferences, and events like this one. And we also have a new series of monographs called Her Nations in Depth, and we have Palestine Square, the blog of IPS, and it features original commentary and analysis from leading experts. We publish a wide range of books in a variety of disciplines in both Arabic and English. Be sure to check out what's available on Amazon at our official site at palestine-studies.org. Be sure to follow us on social media, and we have an email sign-up sheet in the back if you're interested. Thanks very much, and with that, I'll turn it over to Mohammed.
Thank you. As a student before leading the MENA Forum, I really appreciate being here on Friday during finals. I fully understand how it's so stressful. First of all, for those who doesn't know me, my name is Mohammed Soliman. I co-chair the Middle East Forum. I'm actually departing, I'm graduating, and Johanna will be taking over. I would love to thank the MENA Forum team for what they have done just to organize such an event with Dr. Fayyad and Professor Erakat. It actually was really, really tiring process. We have been talking about organizing an event about the Palestinian situation for the last years since we arrived in campus. We have had distinguished professors and policymakers in campus talk about the situation from different perspectives. We believe that the Palestinian perspective was a little bit on the shadow and was not really on the focus. Recently, I want to really recite what policy changes that have been happening in Washington, D.C. regarding the Palestinian situation, whether the relocation from the embassy to Jerusalem, or the funding of UNRWA, or recently we're anticipating a peace plan, and I think that this will take in a lot of our own conversation today. Today we acknowledge that we have two distinguished speakers who are representing different perspectives on the Palestinian people. And the discussion today will be very, very interesting because I have a lot of papers, a lot of articles. This was a whole class for me just to prepare for both of you. I required a lot of listening to podcasts, YouTubes, Washington Post, Princeton podcast. It was very, very tiring. So I was
Why because of an education though?
I was starting with our own Professor Noura Erakat. Of course, our own because she used to be teaching here at Georgetown. She also Georgetown alum. She had her own LLM from Georgetown Law Center, and she was teaching here. Before that, you had your undergrad and your JD from UC Berkeley. We have a lot of people from Berkeley, so they will shoot up for you. She is a scholar on international law, refugee law. She focused on the Palestinian situation, social justice studies. You are also frequent teaching fellow at Temple Law School. You also taught at Georgetown, the Middle Eastern Department. I hope that I got all your distinguishing things.
I have one important distinguishing thing, and it just happened last week. But my book is just out, Justice for Some on the Question of Palestine from Stanford.
Yes, and you are teaching currently at Georgetown University.
Correct.
It's a rival school, but we will accept that. Dr. Fayyad, I have literally 2 pages, but I will basically start with the most recent stuff. Just to make sure to So Dr. Fayyad is economist. He's the former Prime Minister of the Palestine Authority between 2008 and 2015. Currently, you are a fellow at the Woodward School of International Affairs in Princeton. Before that, you were Minister of Finance at the Palestinian Authority. You have, I'm sorry, I will skip a lot of things here about your work with the IMF and the World Bank and all these board of advisory. But you are a fellow at the Kennedy School of Government and originally had a BA, MBA, and PhD in economics from Austin, Texas.
No one here is from Austin, Texas, I take it.
Okay. We will start by asking questions that we already have been working on. This will be going for an hour, and then we will shift to questions from the audience. We really respect if the questions are very specific, very concise, not really a statement. We're looking for a question that our own both speakers can really talk about. Thank you so much.
Oh,
I even forgot all this. Yesterday, me and Ben, who's also a board member at the MENA Forum, we were talking about the Kushner peace plan, or the Trump peace plan. It depends on how you describe it.
All in the family, anyway.
Peace is the word, but okay.
Exactly. And we got few remarks from his own comments yesterday, but the top few things that he mentioned a framework. He didn't mention a state for Palestinians, and he didn't really mention the most important things that have been talking about since Oslo backwards. And then I held on the phone with a friend of mine who's living in the West Bank, and I was like, do you advise the Palestinian Authority to move on and maybe sit with the Trump negotiators? Maybe there's something there for the Palestinians. Maybe we can negotiate even if it's a bad deal, or you should basically stay away. And his response was very, very interesting. He was like, most of the things that the Trump administration is trying to promise already have been taken out of the table for the last 2 years. So I'm not really sure what the proposed plan would be about. If you're in government right now, what would be your own response?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for hosting us here. Great pleasure to have the opportunity. I lived in this area for about 11 years, never set foot on campus. Today is my first day. So I'm delighted to have your company understanding the final exams, the rest of it. And the semester yesterday I did my own last class of the semester. A lot to talk about in this question here. You asked me what would my position be on this. You yourself said, we have a saying in Arabic for those who are Arabic speaking here, مكتوب بالعربي عنوانه. Translated literally, letter can be understood based on your reading of the first couple lines, introduction, you know what it's about. So as you indicated, Jerusalem has been quote unquote taken off the table, this question of refugees, other issues, and more. So I take issue with it being called a deal, because I mean, a deal is by definition, speaking now in terms of lawyerly stuff.
You don't need a lawyer to tell you,
It
requires two sides to make a deal.
It requires sides to become a deal. So if it is anything, it's a proposal of sorts. I do not know anything about what is in it. So if it's rumored widely that it's going to be rolled out in about 4 or 5 weeks, something like this. I don't know. There's a great deal of uncertainty still. Some believe actually there may not be a component to it that really touches on political issues. There is this economic component. I don't know. I'm just speculating. But let me also add that if we really spark it there, it's not really very helpful, because if we just take what is being said about this deal, quote unquote, it would make it look like, you know, things were going well until Trump showed up, until he really started to talk about this peace plan or deal or whatever, whatever it is.
And yet we as students and as citizens of this country or residents of this country can't see that with clarity and be upset over it because of the information that we're fed, because of what Noam Chomsky tells us is the manufacture of consent. So that have you ever seen a map on television? Have you ever seen a layout of the settlement enterprise in the West Bank? Have you ever seen the Western Aquifer that it lays in, the majority of the Western Aquifer, the major source of water that Israel covets is in the West Bank. It wants it. And several Israeli leaders have said they'll never give it back. The desire over the Golan Heights is also over water because of the Yarmouk and the Litani rivers. These are things that are self-evident on a map, and yet we are not shown them, not by accident. So yes, Palestinians lack a national vision because the two-state solution is dead, but the one-state solution also doesn't suffice as a national vision. Palestinians need a process of decolonization. How is it that they reshape their relationships as natives on a land to a settler sovereign on that land, to reconstitute that relationship? As it stands, there is no parity between Israel, the US's self-described most unique ally in the Middle East, the 11th most powerful military in the world, the only nuclear power in the Middle East, a juridical state since 1948, and a stateless people, which does not have the capacity to change that reality on the ground in the way that Israel does have the capacity and does change that reality. Okay, so that power dynamic of us to think about, that power disparity, is especially important when we think about what is this deal of the century. The deal of the century is basically the epitome rolling out of might makes right at its apex. The logic of it and the reason that the Trump administration is saying that it's a bold solution is because they're basically saying, look, we couldn't coerce Palestinians to accept this bad deal, so now we'll force them to do it. We will take Jerusalem off the table. We will cut $364 million of aid to the UN Refugees Works Agency, to humanitarians, refugees in need. We'll cut that aid. They have cut $200 million of aid to US aid projects in the West Bank that includes aid to East Jerusalem hospitals. We are talking about duress. If we want to bring up the law in legal terms, this is not a deal. This is duress. When you put a gun to someone's head and tell them to sign a contract, that contract is null and void. And this is what is being presented to the Palestinians. Now, as an educator, I want to step back a little bit. And how did we get here? I agree completely with Dr. Fayyad that this wasn't Trump's problem. Trump did not inaugurate this problem. This has been the US's policy since 1967 and Lyndon B. Johnson, when that administration inaugurated a qualitative military edge for Israel so that it can defeat singularly or collectively any Arab armies or forces, together with providing Israel with unequivocal diplomatic aid, shielding it in the UN Security Council, issuing 44 vetoes between 1967 and the present so that no international movement can be had on these questions of relevance to the globe. So this is not new, this is a continuity. The Oslo, the Declaration of Principles, which is signed in 1993, is in fact verbatim, what the 1978 Middle East framework says that led up to the 1979 peace accord between Egypt and Israel. And at that time, basically a 2-year interim process, a 3-year final status process where all the most significant issues are placed on the final status. When in 1978 that was presented, Palestinians formed a national congress in Gaza and in the West Bank and said, no to an autonomy framework. We want independence. And the PLO was against it. And yet in 1993, we see the PLO itself sign that agreement. It wasn't just Muhammad that the deal of the century doesn't mention a Palestinian state. Scour as students, the Declaration of Principles, scour Oslo II, scour the Y Accords. There is no mention of a Palestinian state. There has never been negotiations over a Palestinian state that was never on the table. Rabin, who was the most seen as the best ally and the most favorable to the Palestinian cause, said there will never be a return to the 1967 lines. 3 times, never, never, never. What this is, what Oslo has been and continues to be, is an autonomy plan. It's a framework for derivative sovereignty. It looks like black homelands in South Africa that the world rejected. It looks like reservations in the United States that we can't see and don't recognize in forms of native sovereignty. So, moving forward, we need a vision, Palestinians need a vision to be able to overcome what I call a sovereignty trap, which is this perpetual state where natives must earn the approval from the settler sovereign in order to exercise limited amounts of sovereignty with no promise of independence. So how do we escape this sovereignty trap? And the first thing, whether you're for 2 states or for a single state or for no state, all of us need to agree that Oslo is the problem and is null and void.
Thank you, Fayyad. I would take you, a couple of weeks ago, there was elections in Israel. Benny Gantz was being perceived and held as a centrist. Netanyahu won elections. Actually got the same seats, but Netanyahu right now is from a government. He had 35 seats, and he will get the Hamas, Jewish Power, Shas, multiple smaller right-wing parties to form, and this would be, he will be 10 years, like the longest serving prime minister in Israel. Apparently he's looking for a legacy. And apparently this legacy is annexation. He doesn't shy away from annexation. He doesn't shy away from saying this publicly, even on the international stage, which is different from the old Netanyahu that we know before 2010. My question here is annexation of Area C can be reversed? Second, can be a state in West Bank without Area C? I have here a paper by Dr. Mohammed Soliman, and he is the chairman of the Palestine Investment Fund. And he wrote that without Area C, Area C is always being mentioned as, by de facto, it will go away in a land swap with the Israeli state, and there's no right to Palestinians. So anyway, if it's annexed, it doesn't matter. But he says in this paper that without Area C, there is no economic incentive for the West Bank. People will not really be empowered, no jobs. At least 23% of the GDP will be lost. What do you think?
Yeah, on the numbers and the viability issue, as a matter of fact, there is a very good study that the World Bank did and published back in 2013-2014 about this very subject in terms of what Area C means economically to the rest of the West Bank, etc. And for those of you interested, it really is a good study. It took a lot of work and it's a very good document. But we comment first on the question of annexation. Yet another example of something that is really thrown out there, and then all of a sudden everybody's talking about it as if it is being contemplated. You know, there is this thing, this bad thing that's going to happen. And actually the most absurd form of it, at least in my own view, is when they say maybe they will not annex. Maybe, for starters, they will extend the applicability of Israeli law and jurisdiction to the settlements. For those of you who know anything about the setup there, when was it last that settlers kind of went to settle the case in Ramallah court, for example, or something? So again, it's really not only smoking mirrors, moving mirrors all the time. It's as if this is something that's going to happen. I think for all practical purposes, Area C has been de facto annexed to Israel. Israel never relinquished anything, and by I mean to say anything, because not really only territory, but any control over Area C at all, none whatsoever. This whole designation, by the way, for those who are interested in agreement, how it's written and all that sort of thing. This is something that should have ended 18 months after the convening of the First Palestinian Council. So this, in the summer of 1997, it should have been over automatically. Not negotiations, not anything. Contrast that, if you will, with what's been said about Area C by Israeli politicians and think tank community there about Area C, including what was said in connection with it having been highlighted as such an important area and field of operation for Palestinian Authority, including during the time when I was Prime Minister, for example. And they saw actually that kind of focus and emphasis on Area C as an act of hostility and something that could bring about war, because there was no way they could conceive of a possibility of Israel ever relinquishing control over Area C. This is just goes to tell you that this thing that would be being scared of now about areas about to be annexed and all of that sort of thing. Well, I mean that's past tense. I'm afraid. There is a lot that really can be said along the same lines, of course, a lot more when it comes to Jerusalem. Really got focused about the actions taken by Trump, first recognizing Jerusalem as capital of Israel. He sent the Jewish people, as a matter of fact, and all, and question of Unrwa, and the rest of it. But there are a lot of things that actually have been decided already, pretty much. Fait accompli, as Dr. Erakat pointed out, to the extent that there is something that's going to be rolled out here, what it is intended to do, what its effect will be, to just basically enshrine all of this in some, can really move the conscience of the international community, Palestinian people, and everyone else. It's soft enough now, the assessment is, to where, one last thing and it's really all over. I mean, it's the final stage of getting something done. So yeah, I mean, I just really would like to flag this as something that one really needs to keep in mind as one assesses what's being said and plans and intentions and so on.
For you, Dr. Erakat, as a legal scholar, annexation, what does it mean legally? Second, moving from martial law inside the West Bank to civilian Israeli law, what does it actually mean? What's the real actual impact that we have there?
I'm going to answer your questions and then say what I'd like to also respond to this. So let me answer the questions really quick. Annexation is illegal under international law. It's the prohibition of acquisition of territory by force. We established as an international community that there's a prohibition on territorial conquest as early as the 19th century, because otherwise countries can basically go to war in order to acquire the lands that they desire. So this is done. Yet what we're seeing now happen is a contest of that framework, and basically a exception. Israel wants to make an exception that it can remain illegal, but not when it does it. So for example, Russia can make the same claims now in Crimea because it's taken over that territory by force, but we don't recognize that. And in fact, in 1967, the big debate within the Security Council that culminates in Resolution 242 is over whether Israel must withdraw immediately or whether Israel can remain and negotiate withdrawal in exchange for permanent peace. But it was accepted that the land was Arab and will be returned to its Arab sovereigns or its Arab peoples. So the fact that now is this resurrection where Israel is saying, oh yeah, we can annex it, and Israeli representatives can straight face tell the international community, I think it was Danny Dunham yesterday, who said, the Bible is my deed, is my land deed. And that's, we might laugh, but we've allowed Israel to also have the space to create this exception for itself because of our unwillingness to place pressure on Israel. States don't comply with international law or human rights because of their goodness. If they did, the United States would not be caging children at the border and separating them from their families. We would not have police officers in this country able to kill any black unarmed civilians and not be prosecuted. States don't act out of their goodwill. They must be pressured. It is people who force states to behave in a particular way. And that is precisely what has been at stake. What Palestinians have been, frankly, had their hands tied behind their back since the peace agreement, because anything that the Palestinians have done since 1993, whether it be a legal challenge to Israel in the ICC or the ICJ, whether they go to the Security Council, they try to declare a state, Israel has declared all of that legal warfare. But the appeal to law, Israel describes as warfare. It's incapacitated any kind of accountability. What does that leave for Palestinians in the way of being able to resist this condition and to change Israel's behavior? Because of this incapacitation, they've asked the international community to support them. They said, listen, we can't do it. We're killed with impunity, our lands are taken, our legal protest is deemed as terrorism, any resort to arms is ipso facto criminal and terroristic. We need the international community to support us in boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And people ignored that and thought it was silly until we see the efficacy of BDS grow. So that now 41 out of 50 US states have legislation or propose legislation to criminalize BDS in their states. That has been overturned now in Texas and I think in Kentucky because of Supreme Court challenges as a violation of the First Amendment right to boycott and as a form of speech. But it's also what Netanyahu has declared as the second most significant threat to Israel after a nuclear-capable Iran. But if you take away even the boycott, what is left to hold Israel to account? How else are you going to pressure a state that has no incentive to change its behavior, that says that the Bible and that religious deeds give them the right to land, to change their behavior? So just one last thing on this. On the annexation and on these things, another really important point, the final status issues, do you know what they are? The things that were never negotiated but were supposed to negotiate after 18 months? Jerusalem, refugees, water, borders, and settlements. The most significant issues have yet to be discussed, and Israel, using its power and the support of the US, is changing those facts on the ground. And so here again is the question of why are we still being bound by this framework? And as to Jerusalem and the rest, for all Palestinians, not just in the West Bank, but also in Gaza and also citizens of Israel, the concern is not necessarily just Jerusalem as the future Palestinian capital, it's the ability to stay in their homes. Palestinians are being removed. It's an ethnic cleansing process. For before people's red flags go up, ethnic cleansing is also a term in international law. It's known as forced population transfer. It is prohibited according to the Apartheid Convention of 1973. It's also a war crime. And yet here, we're not even allowed to say it. But Palestinians are being ethnically cleansed, and they're being removed specifically from Area C to areas A and B. Since '93, to prepare for this, what is now the annexation, and within Israel as well, they're being removed. Palestinian citizens are being removed from the south and the Naqab or the Negev. About 70,000 Palestinians are having their homes demolished and being removed into urban townships. So how does changing the way that we think about this free us as thinkers and as visionaries and as peacemakers to free ourselves of this two-state paradigm in order to think of actually what is the better way forward to achieve some sort of peace and justice?
In Cairo, I have the luxury of studying with a lot of Palestinian students in my school of engineering, yeah. And even here, whenever you are discussing with, and this is a different generation, look at millennials, people were born after 1990s, the second intifada was always like shaped their own childhood in the West Bank and Gaza, or 9/11 on the international level. And there is a growing sense, one idea, you can call it crazy or not. If the West Bank is already outside, if the West Bank is already being annexed to Area C, and we are already under a martial Israeli law, let's dissolve the Palestinian Authority. Like, why would we be the caretaker for the Israeli occupation in the West Bank? Why you're paying the price? Also, you're being legitimized by the local population that might see the security arrangements between the PA, the Palestinian Authority, and Israel as maybe something unethical. Maybe it's the time. Maybe if already everything, as Dr. Erakat mentioned, is already out of the table, out of the deal, maybe it's the time to dissolve the PA as a former prime minister. What do you think about that?
Well, I think the context in which the PA was created is well known. It's Oslo, and as you have just heard, there isn't anything in those documents about Palestinian sovereignty or Palestinian statehood or anything like that. At the very best, it was kind of implied or thought as a possible outcome. That's what the Israeli negotiators were told to ensure documents would be written anywhere, not to make the state of Palestine the outcome, a possible. And when you see the language and how it was really all done, just as we were talking about the US plan or such proposals about to be rolled out, we're told the agreement itself came to enshrine pre-existing asymmetries, and that's what that whole framework was about. Now, of course, with the benefit of hindsight, you can really look and dissect this and see how could it be that something like this was actually signed, beginning with the so-called Declaration on Mutual Recognition, which is highly skilled in an incredible way, do all of these things. It's quite possible, I wasn't there, but it's possible that, all of this was understood for what it was, but the bet was 5 years later we're going to have a state anyway. So even if it really had all of those deficiencies, I'm not really well schooled on this subject to really give you the history of how those decisions were actually made. I was not really there to know for sure. So I'm speculating, even if those problems, deficiencies were foreseen, and I'll get to the specific question of PA itself, including limitations what the PA could do or not do, including limitations in Area C, including the fact that the Palestinian Authority was not to have any jurisdiction whatsoever over East Jerusalem, and what have you. All of this stuff was understood. It's not that our leadership did not really understand it, but the bet was like 5 years later we're going to have a state anyway. So if we really had accepted that form of abridged power, if you will, under Oslo framework for 5 years, including security obligations, all obligations that came with it on the Palestinian side, if you could rationalize or understand it, certainly the question of what to do after 4th of May 1999 question is legitimate, including all structures, including the PA itself, etc. My own view on this is Oslo aside, you need Palestinian leadership to take care of the needs of our people in the territories occupied by Israel in 1967. You need Palestinian leadership that looks after the interests of Palestinians everywhere in the world. That's our PLO. PLO, so legitimate representative of Palestinian people. So throughout, up until Oslo, until 1994, when the PA came into existence, there was not such body. So there is this body. I think what you do with it is your own choice. I mean, that's really the kind of empowerment that I'm talking about. I'm really very cognizant of all of these restrictions, limitations. The power is asymmetric as a rule, but it's incumbent upon us to not make it an instrument of this empowerment, as it is. You see what I'm saying? So I can relate to the argument that, just as we should do it away with everything that came with this disaster that's Oslo, beginning with the PA itself, absorb ourselves with all kinds of obligations, whatever, and structures, including PA itself. I like to really think it is still possible to think in terms of ways that are capable of turning this into a chief instrument of empowerment for Palestinian people, because if the PA is gone, something else is going to replace it. It doesn't really have to be exactly the same. I'm not really saying it should really continue to act in the same way that it's acting now, whether in terms of how it governs or how it deals with the international community, the rest of it, etc. I think each aspect of its activity ought to really be reviewed, and it really has to be examined with a view to ensuring that it's an instrument of empowerment. If it is not, and to the extent it is not, that should be fixed. But to do away with it, I really need to think about the alternative. What do I have to do in order to really come up with something different? It's not really enough to say, let's bring the house down. I mean, this whole thing is doomed, so let's bring the house down. Let's do that. Think day after, what do we do? We need something. So if we have something, and if it's really possible to do something with it in a way that could really begin to inspire our people, including especially the millennials, who make up about 2/3 of us, by the way. I mean, this is really important. Clearly, major work needs to be done, and we need to liberate ourselves of the shackles, mentally, if you will, the thought that we cannot do anything in the face of this brute force that's out there. And that to me is a very high form of resistance. If we in fact dedicate ourselves to turning this into a serious instrument of empowerment and resistance in the way it should be and can be, I see nothing wrong with it, and I'm prepared to engage in a conversation on this and I did with our young people throughout, and to this day, it just happens to be my view. I understand it if somebody is really so sick of everything and say, just bring the house down. I really can't relate to that sentiment too.
I have a very special question for
I
you.
don't get to answer that?
Sorry, you can.
What? That's like the best question ever. Should the PA be dissolved? Hello? So I know that you all think, oh, the obvious answer is, well, of course, if they're part of the problem and they're like a subcontracting company in cooperation, did I say company? Maybe that was a Freudian slip. A subcontracting institution to Israel's occupation, that it should be dissolved. Here I want to caution and say that I think that our emphasis on the PA is also not very productive, right? Just focusing on getting rid of the PA is not going to answer the question, because we have a lot of systems that have been entrenched that are not going to be overturned, okay? So I want to share a few things and then actually ask Dr. Fayyad a question about empowerment. We agree on a lot, but there's a few things that we disagree on. Number one, in terms of what is the drafting history? So when I started writing my own chapter on Oslo, I started looking at it as a legal document, but it was so obvious how bad it was. I was like, anyone literate, right, can provide an analysis that this was a horrible agreement that actually advances Israel's interests and has basically handicapped Palestinians even further. So I encourage you as students to read that if you haven't, okay? And that's it. You've already understood Oslo sucks as a legal document for Palestinians. So I was left then, well then what? If I can't say the obvious in my book, what else am I going to say? So I wanted to answer the precise question that Dr. Fayyad posed. How did the Israeli negotiators, convince Palestinians to sign on to this? And why did Palestinians agree to it? So I read memoirs of Israelis and Palestinian negotiators. I went and traveled to the region. I did interviews with the negotiators in order to figure out what was happening in Madrid and Washington versus the back channel in Norway. And what I come up with is basically chapter 4. So yes, that's a plug for the book, because I can't give you that whole summary, but I will say this, and it's a very devastating story. It's a very devastating story of internal, frankly, betrayal of the Palestinian leadership to the Palestinian people. But Palestinians did not revolt at that time. The PNC, or the Palestinian National Council, that oversees the PLO, voted for it. Only 25 members of the PNC boycotted the meeting. Multiple people resigned, but several people, the majority of the Palestinian cadre didn't resign. So there was a belief that this was the best that we can get. And what was at stake was actually preserving the PLO, because that was what was at risk. The Palestinian national cause was not at risk. So in that agreement, I believe that Chairman Arafat at the time agreed to Oslo in order to preserve the PLO. In exchange, gave up everything else that Palestinians have in a form of a legal document, and then believed on good faith, this is not my language, this is the PLO's own language, in quotes, they believed on good faith that Israel would still withdraw from the territories. Okay? And if you think that that's really naive and bad lawyering, add to that the fact that they didn't even have any kind of legal oversight of this legal agreement. So in terms of this issue, I kind of know why we ended up here. And it was a major victory for Israel. Oslo was a major victory for Israel. They were able to consolidate all of its gains since 1973. Or 1979, when Menachem Begin becomes prime minister, the Likud ascends, and they began to accelerate their settlement project, although it was Labor that initiated the settlement project under, I shouldn't say this wrong. I'm forgetting his name, it's going to come at the most inappropriate time. But it was a Labor leader who initiated that process. Okay, so that's one. On the second, should the PA dissolve? That's, yes, obviously it is part of the problem, but that's not going to solve anything. That's not going to solve anything. As far as the Oslo Accords are concerned, the PA is an administrative body. They're responsible for the distribution of, water, picking up garbage, overseeing of schools, right? They can stay. They have an administrative function. The problem is that the PA has been collapsed with the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And so now there's no international governing body. And those two have become the same thing. So get rid of the PA, you still don't have a leadership. And even if you did have a leadership, because this particular group, I think, President Abbas has initiated and convened the PLO in order to reconstruct it, and the PNC, but it's mostly of members that are not democratically elected, and so they will claim that they have a PLO, they still don't have a national project. So that doesn't solve anything, right? We are very much bound and stuck in a place without a political vision. And the other problem is that they were also bound by these legal agreements. This wasn't just giving away Palestinians in Oslo, just so you all know, because Dr. Fayyad mentioned something important. When we signed Oslo, it gave us jurisdiction over people and some lands. What does that mean in legal terms? If I have jurisdiction over all of you, but I don't have jurisdiction over the land that you stand on, that means that somebody else controls this land and can remove you, okay? It also means that if there's settlers on this land, I can't hold them criminally liable. So under Oslo, you basically have a system where Palestinians can police themselves but can't protect themselves against the settlers, and in fact are protecting the settlers against Palestinians. As a form of agreement, this is the security coordination. But in addition to security coordination, we also have economic coordination. And so this is the question I'm leading up to for Dr. Fayyad. The idea of economic coordination is seen as, frankly, one of the ways that we're inextricably tied. Palestinians don't have an economy without collaboration and coordination with Israel. In the Paris Protocols, that was seen as a peacemaking endeavor. But instead it's become like holding Palestinians hostage. Anything that you threaten us with, we will sever these ties and destroy the Palestinian economy, right? So if we want to empower a people and a population, and especially young people, our leadership is quite experienced, seasoned, they've done their work, they need to move, and let young people lead. When Arafat took over the PLO, it was an Arab organization that was established by Jamal Abdel Nasser, okay? And he took it, established in 1964. It was Arafat along with armed Palestinian groups who took it over in 1968. He was 44 years old. That was why he was fearless, I think. Young people are fearless. When you get older, you start to think, well, my comfort, my home, my interests, my children, the ability to be visionary, lessons, right? So then the question is, one, we do need to reinvigorate this young leadership. I think if the PA stays, but at least makes room for young Palestinians rather than frankly coordinating with Israel to put them in prison, which is what's been happening, then that would be fantastic. And two, we have a situation where Palestinians today are in severe, severe debt. And from my colleagues who study the economy, they attribute that to many of your policies, Dr. Fayyad. And so I'm sure you prepared for this question. I mean, everybody wants to understand. Between 2008 and 2018, Palestinian debt has increased by 1,795%. By 1,795%. What does it mean to be in debt? That means you've been issued credit lines to buy cars and homes and travel. But if you have debt, what's your main concern? Paying it off. Your willingness to protest and to revolt is diminished significantly because of one, you're living in relative comfort, but two, you're strapped with debt. So my question is, would you have changed that in retrospect? Was this a mistake? Was this something positive? Where are we going with this? How do we free ourselves of that debt now in order to move towards the empowerment, which I completely agree with?
I should be prepared to answer this question because I was asked it many times.
I'm sure.
But clearly I have not been doing a good enough job explaining myself because I keep being asked the question. So let me try.
Okay.
Let's
go.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Just making sure that I have like different questions for each of you. For that, 10, 20
See, I'm not going to get a chance to answer.
Yeah, answer for sure.
So I'll try anyway to really give you an answer, and I think that I'm prepared to do that, so don't allow yourself to be too impressed if I will mention some facts because I've been impressed. The issue is it's something that's been said many times, and along the same lines that you just and they take it a step beyond what you said, which is this was all done by design in order to. That's something you didn't say. I know you didn't, but they add to it that all of this kind of was done by design in order to really get people to be entrapped, essentially, because they have these obligations that really kind of get out of. They don't have a car loan before to worry about now they do. They don't have a house loan to worry about when they do, etc., etc., etc. I really have to be very honest with you on this. Honest to God, I really never Speaking very, very frankly, honestly, I was there when this happened, when this can really rise in personal death. That you're talking about, not PA official death, but personal death, personal personhood. When it happened, it definitely was not at all part of the strategy in and of itself. We're kind of really thinking what is it that we really should do in order for people to borrow more and kind of really track it or anything like that. The first time I was kind of really made aware of it in a political sense was when I was asked this question. And then, what happened? My own actual disposition on question of bank lending to people. I mean, obviously, not much was known about me before I joined the PA. I was with the IMF, and the Palestinian Authority, when I was representing the IMF, was constantly complaining, the government that is, constantly complaining about how little banks were lending out in Palestine. That banks, commercial banks that is, were there to collect savings from people, then invest them abroad, but very, very low debt to deposit ratio. 25%, 26%, 27%, 30%, very more. And my position on it was kind of really fundamentalist whenever they raised this, because I thought it was too much risk, and it's not really good policy for banks to be pushed into lending people when those loan decisions are not sound, because then banks will fail, and there's no one out there to really actually bail them out. I mean, we did not have the capacity. Our equivalent of central bank is not really much of the central bank. It can't really do anything to save banks or anything like that. I viewed it as a disaster, that you should really have a hands-off policy when it comes to this. Let this be a private sector kind of decision between banks and people. Don't let banks kind of really do what they can. If it is profitable and safe for them to lend in Palestine as opposed to invest abroad, they do that. They're out there to make money. That's their job. That's what they're. So that was my position. At no point when I was in government did I really approach banks and can really check with them, gather them and said, hey guys, you really need to go out and do more lending and all of that sort of thing. What happened was a combination of things. And this is really the truth as I know it. What happened was things started to stabilize after the mid-2007, let's just say, early 2008, people were beginning to really see some sense of normalcy. By that I mean banks in particular. And that's when you really started to see, if you look at data, that's when you really see this thing beginning to really take off. All of a sudden, the 30% is no longer 30%, it's 40%, 50%. It never really got to a point where it was dangerous or where we thought that the banks were doing too much to the point where it was an unsound banking practice. That's the job of the monetary authority, not the government. Its job is to ensure that bank supervision is done right and that there was not too much risk that's being taken, because we're not really in a position to bail out anyone. So it is what it is. People really started to borrow. Salary payments started to really be regular. So banks use that as a collateral. They thought of it as good enough collateral. People really started to acquire things, like cars if they did not have one, maybe a home or something like this. That's really the extent of it. That's the extent of it. Now, just like every other people anywhere around the world, we know the game. Everybody has gone through this in their life at some point or another. I still am going through that, where you borrow and then the time comes for you to repay back, and it's difficult. You have to make some adjustments here and there in order to do that. Did that in some way lull people into believing that, let's just forget about everything else, let's forget about national aspirations and become enslaved by this sort of thing, only find a way to make ends meet and all. Honestly, I really do not know that that is the case for sure. All I can tell you is that there is a very high rate of unemployment in Palestine. Not only in Gaza, but in West Bank as well. Ours is, unfortunately, we have the biggest distinction of having probably the highest in the world, particularly amongst youth. No means, no banks, no borrowing, none whatsoever. And people mobilize. People participate in acts of defiance in the face of occupation and the rest of it, and they do that. I don't see it as having inhibited that kind of really yearning for working toward attainment of national aspirations, but that's really how it really came about. We never really got into prodding banks into borrowing, nor did we really at all in any way, certainly not directly, encourage consumers to go out and borrow. Never really, the way I used to answer is like, I never really knocked on people's door and told them, morning, come with the nearest bank and talk to the bank, giving them money. They just did these individual decisions, no more. As things started to normalize, that that ratio rose. That's all there is to it. And if the monetary authority is doing its job, as a matter of fact, the ratio of non-conforming loans is fairly within range of reasonable in Palestine, notwithstanding how difficult the conditions there are, which tells you that this is really within the norm, within what might be regarded as normal. That's really all that there's to it.
I'll have one question for each. Just one question each, like 2 minutes. Just making sure that we have space and time for other questions from the audience. For you, Professor Fayyad. So Arab Spring is here since 2010. We have been, like multiple regimes have been falling. Ben Ali, Mubarak, Omar Bashir, you count them. There's a lot of talk about Chairman Mahmoud Abbas. A lot of people talking about how he's aging. Maybe he's not really capable of functioning as chairman of the Palestinian Authority. Maybe he's outdated. And also, not only about his own capacity, but also who can succeed him. Who is the person who, if there's a line of command, if there's a line of succession, will it be elections? What would be the case if tomorrow we truly have Mahmoud Abbas in the UK?
It's been a question on the table for many years now, to be honest with you. It's not only the past year or two who's going to really succeed Abbas and all. And before, when Abu Ammar or late President Yasser Arafat actually was in power, the question was who's going to really succeed Yasser Arafat and all. We're kind of pigeonholed somehow, we're treated differently when it comes to this issue. The question is who. Maybe you have something to do with this, in the sense of us not having well-defined processes that will take care of succession when the time comes for succession and all of that. So, to the extent we are guilty of some of that, it's fine, I accept it. But I'm not really comfortable with this incredible preoccupation with who is going to succeed President Abbas. I'd much rather have the question put differently, and focus more on process, that leads to succession. And when you really put it this way, question of who really becomes much less important. In a way, when you really continue to frame it this way, you reinforce what has been a proclivity, not only in Palestine, but throughout the region. You mentioned the region and all of that sort of thing. For people, when they go to really have already handpicked their successors and things like this, or if this hereditary rule is established, who's going to really come in this. In our case, with much as that has been said about President Abbas and what's going to happen after that, my own ideas on this is simple. What needs to happen is, and this should be the first act of Palestinian empowerment at this stage. What should happen is for the President Abbas, to have something which no other Palestinian alive today I know of has, namely convening power. Convening power. He still has convening power. To use that convening power to convene a meeting, to bring people around the table, all of them, not only PLO factions, but everyone else, to really get them to really discuss and begin a serious discussion on a national agenda going forward. And that should include upfront a consideration of what do we do in the interim while we're thinking about the strategy and debating it and engaging in this serious dialogue that's aimed at forging as broad a consensus, national consensus as possible on it. What do we do over the next year, 2, 3 years, whatever, while we're talking? Because there are needs as things go. There are challenges. People look only at international challenges, Trump and all of that, domestic challenges as well. There are people, everyday stuff that we really have to deal with. What do you need to do during this period? So it's this kind of consideration that needs to take place. In this formulation, he clearly is to preside over this period. There's no question. And there is a proposal for election at some point during that transition. And not election immediately, because that's not realistic. Now, when you hear Palestinian leaders talking about elections in 6 months or 3 months, that's when you know we're not serious about it, because it's just not really possible. Nor do I really believe, given existing conditions, elections are going to be inclusive or meaningful in the sense of the political space being opened up adequately in order for the young people to participate, get enfranchised, and the rest of it. To do that, I think it would be best to find a way to have Palestinians collectively decide on matters that pertain to our faith at the macro level, and that is really the forum that I'm really talking to you about. But also we need a government that has participation by all components of Palestinian political system, including factions that are not part of the Palestinian of the PLO, including those, as a matter of fact, regardless, notwithstanding the so-called quartet principles and what have you, and all of that sort of thing, and to run this and to prepare the ground for elections 3-4 years down the road and all of that sort of thing. In the meantime, some elements of accountability begin to really actually be incorporated in the way we do things. So what do you see about what we see now in terms of a landscape that is not permissive of political participation to the extent that it needs to be, begins to shrink a little bit, and the scope for participation begins to expand, and also when the time comes for election, you could have a meaningful process. A government of national unity has the advantage of imparting a measure of accountability that's absent when you do not have government of national unity. In addition, unfortunately, our PNC legislature has been dissolved. But part of my thinking was to really actually get that to really function again, to really add another layer of accountability. And by the way, under our basic law, a question of what happens if there is a vacancy in the presidency is resolved. And it's something that we actually did. That's how President Abbas became president. There was an interim president, was speaker of the legislature for a couple of months. There was an election, and the president was elected. So if we have the legislature, and I'm all for, as a matter of fact, getting that convened again in the interim. It's better to have that than not to have it. Part of what it could do then, should the vacancy happen, would be to actually provide an answer. But while there is no vacancy, the president will continue to preside over this transition, which would see a serious effort toward trying to forge consensus on an agenda, a national vision going forward that everybody can subscribe to, but at the same time, manages and attends to the needs of our people in the occupied Palestinian territory, in all of it, and in unified politics, unifying our institutions, legal frameworks, and all, is an act of empowerment. That's something that we really should do. It's the first thing that we should do. That's where I really would like to see the transition going, as opposed to what's going to really happen, who's going to be next, and all of that. There is tremendous preoccupation with this, and it really explains a lot about how things are evolving politically, the way the system acts and reacts, and all. This obsession with who's going to be there next, and as soon as we can move away from this, I think that we will be for our own good. This is not meant to be a diplomatic answer. This is how I really feel about it. I mean, I've written about it, and I'm on record and said that many times.
Would you like to respond to that, or have a different question?
Oh, this is so fun. Can I hear the other question?
No, so you can get that.
I have to guess?
Yeah. You have to choose. You have 4 minutes before we start to finish the question.
Is it the next question about law?
No.
Oh, because I was going to say, if it's about law, I don't want to answer it. You do the law. People always ask me questions about law. I'm a critical legal scholar, so I do believe that the law is an inflection of power. I guess I'll answer this question because it's a conversation which I think is critical and actually productive, and not necessarily answer the question of who is the successor. I agree. The obsession on who is the successor, is the two-state solution viable? All of these are surface questions that actually are part of the problem, because they maintain a veneer of some sort of diplomacy and process when in fact it's entrenching a status quo and it keeps us in place. So I think that those questions are very dangerous. I think that the fact that our media, our journalists are supposed to ask tough questions. They're supposed to also inform knowledge. And yet on this issue, our media ask questions that they could have asked in 2002. They ask the same questions. The ones that who's the successor, who's the leader. It's because the world after 1993 ceased to understand and envision that Palestine is a freedom struggle. Okay? Palestine is not a state-building project. It is a freedom, it represents a people's freedom struggle. It is a movement to end a siege, to end systematic warfare in Gaza and in the West Bank. It is a movement that actually is claiming home in Jerusalem, in the Negev, and throughout in Haifa, in Jaffa, or Jaffo, which is in Israel today, is the site of the greatest amount of Palestinian displacement. They've removed Palestinians. It was one of the largest cities after Nazareth, after Israel was established. And today, the majority of Jaffa is actually not even Palestinian anymore. They've turned what was historically a seaport, the seaport of Jaffa, which was a fish market and a place for fishermen, an economy, a land-based, sea-based economy. They've turned it into a series of artist colonies for Israeli artists. So when you think about the Palestinian struggle for freedom, and you limit yourself to thinking about a state and sovereignty and independence, you're actually limiting the way that we can think about what is going on with all of Palestinians. How are they facing the same struggle? And that's one to remain on their land, and it's one that seeks freedom, which is essentially this question. So a few things on then, what about what's next? How do we do this? Number one, I just want to tell you that I remembered the name of the Labor Prime Minister in 1967, Levi Eshkol. He was the one that established the first settlements outside of Bethlehem and did it on the veneer as a military camp because they've known it was illegal and have changed the law and the interpretation of the law in order to facilitate settlement expansion under the Labor government. So that's number one. The other thing is, what is it that we do to move forward? How is it that we get past this impasse if we agree that this doesn't work? And I think that that doesn't necessarily begin with just convening people in elections. I think that that's wrong. I think it begins with having ideas and the space to have those ideas. I think it begins with allowing people to lead. Let our youth lead. You know, keep the PA, keep the PLO, but all of the ambassadors, every single one in the diplomatic corps, every single one of the ministers should resign. That's it. You can't serve for your whole life. And the fact that we have not had a turnover is one of our most biggest tragedies for Palestinians. Comp-lit scholar
Entire Middle East.
and Palestine, yeah, exactly, or be removed forcefully, right? Comp-lit scholar and Palestinian icon, frankly, Edward Said, had said in his book, Peace and Its Discontents, that there's no more, Palestinians have an immense amount of talented pool. And the tragedies that we're not using and leveraging that pool of talent, of people who can be representing this cause in a completely different way, in multiple languages. Our diaspora, our Palestinian population is 10 million people. 2/3 of that 10 million live outside of Palestine. That means that they are well-versed in almost every language and can represent this issue in every language in a different framework. Let them. Notably, Chairman Arafat banned Edward Said's book after Oslo, Peace and Its Discontents, because it criticized Oslo. So also know that within the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, there's also been a lot of inability to protest. And so another issue that comes up for Palestinians to protest, my young comrades who do protest complain of who? Palestinian security officers who have prevented them from protesting, for example, in solidarity with their brothers and sisters in Gaza during the wars, right? So we have another issue. Why are the Palestinian security forces policing Palestinians who are protesting war? Because that's part of an arrangement. We have to prove to Israel and to the United States that we can quell Palestinians and keep the peace in order to be able to be considered eligible for independence. This is a trap. This is a trap. And we have to get out of it. So I see Khalid al-Ginti in the back. He's the author. He's formerly of Brookings Institute, also of the National Affairs Department in the Negotiation Supports Unit. Just published a fabulous book called Blind Spot, From Balfour to Trump, which I encourage you all to read. He writes in it, he has a section on your work, and he writes in it that during your tenure, you oversaw in the budget a shift in our Palestinian national budget from things like agriculture and education, and a shift to nearly 30% of our Palestinian national budget to security. So that's another part of the problem. How do we get out of that trap where and I think now the number is 40% actually, 40% on security. So we also have an issue within of what is it that we need within Palestinian culture to snap out of this? Like, you know, the agricultural budget in 1993 was about 12%. Today, the Palestinian national budget for agriculture is 0.5%. When we think about how is it to resist, enabling Palestinian farmers to stay on their lands is a big deal and one of the most powerful forms of resistance. And so it's little things that start with the budget. So I guess that's a question, a provocation, as you like it, or maybe I pitch it to Khalid, he can ask it, he's not.
Audience questions?
I think we should, we're switching to at least 4 questions. I would prefer that when you ask that question, identify yourself and specify a person, one of our own panelists to answer it, please, because we're running out of time. Thank you. Mohammed?
Thanks so much for your presentation. My question is for both of you. We see new normalizations in the relationship between Arab states and Israel. How do you think that will either affect negatively or positively the Palestinian cause in having a state or having sovereignty?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I could do the short answer. I'll do the very short answer. One is, Mohammed Soliman has a great article today in Foreign Affairs, you should read it, on Egyptian-Israeli cooperation. That's instructive, where multiple Egyptian officials are saying that the problem is no longer Israel, it's either Iran or Muslim extremism. So that's just an indication, it's the tip of the iceberg. The fact that the Palestinian cause, one, there's fatigue, two, because of the normalization, there's actually conspiracy against Palestinians by other Arab states rather than solidarity with them. This was also ushered since 1993. That is what began. I think, in the words of Yair Hirschfield, an Israeli negotiator, said that the Oslo Accords actually created the space and inaugurated room to normalize economic relations as well. So I think it's really unfortunate, but I also know that the people in the Arab world, as people in most of the world, and I would think all over the world, are in support of the Palestinian cause, and it's precisely why the US funds authoritarian regimes in the Middle East, because they're afraid of democracy. Because what happens when peoples of the Arab world govern themselves, they probably shift this entire status quo, including their relationship to Israel.
If I may, since there were some questions asked of me on budget and priorities alone, if I may just take advantage of clarify, because I don't have really much to add to what we said about normalization, except maybe just one thing, which builds on the gap that exists between Arab people on the one hand and what leadership is reported to say or how they feel on the other. And that is something that this administration in particular has invested heavily in. They came in talking about outside in, meaning bringing Arabs on board in order for them to really actually prevail on the Palestinians to accept some kind of deal and something like this. That's naive. That's just not going to happen. I don't think so. I mean, compared with things that were said about this early on and things that leaked to the media subsequently, what things are and actions taken, it's clear that this is not a good bet. Let's put it this way. Precisely because it's not, Palestinian cause still popular, the cause amongst Arabs, and it's really going to be exceedingly difficult for Arab countries to really actually move openly in the direction of normalizing as if this issue has been settled and Palestinians have attained their rights. On a question of budget priorities and the observation made about spending on security as opposed to agriculture, in terms of the shift, the word shift that you used actually is correct one. If the comparison is between before the PA and after the PA. And the reason for that, since we're really talking about things in percentage terms, is because before there was no security service altogether. You see what I'm saying? PA came in and they started to set up shop. They took some civil servants who were working in the civil administration, so-called Israeli civil administration, started to build an administration. I was there as a witness for a good part of that period before I joined the PA in 2002 as Minister of Finance, totally ever so preoccupied with expanding public sector and expanding payroll, both on the civilian side and on the security side. And this actually happened before I joined the PA. That was the worry. Every month we'll be looking to see what happened to the payroll and how many more people were added last month, and so on and so forth. So both on the civilian side and the security side, things expanded dramatically. Whether it's still 30% or something else, that's besides the point. It's a sizable chunk of the Palestinian budget. But just to clarify, I mean, really this is just the way I saw it all the time. There's not an authority that really has been investing in buying F-16s or anything like that. Let's say budget and 30%, 40%, and something like this. This is really a payroll issue. It's really wages for security personnel. Good part of them were added to the payroll as a form of, hiring people. And it was a lot easier for the PA early on, shortly after it came into being, to hire people on the security side than on the civilian side, because you presumably did not need that much of prior training or anything like that to be on security services. Not in all positions, but at least a good chunk of them. You cannot really hire people with no background to the Minister of Finance or Minister of Education or something like this. So the need to hire, and if you really actually look at the numbers and the series there, it's very instructive. It shot up so dramatically after Israel started to resort to the closure policy in 1996. Israel got the system shutting out Gaza completely, shutting it down. West Bank similarly. And in one day, 120, 130, 140 Palestinians who crossed into Israel to work for the day and come back, none of them are going. Those were days when I saw, as I'm a press rep at the time, lines of people standing, waiting just to really see the Minister of Finance and just run. Maybe they'll get a piece of paper. And the authority at the time came up with all kinds of schemes, including something that's called temporary employment, where they just add people, not to the payroll officially. So to the IMF and the world, they would not really say we're hiring people. But this is temporary for 2 or 3 months, and the 2 or 3 months then became 4 or 5 months, 6 months. And then they ended up being all incorporated in the payroll. Whether on the security side or the civilian side, but especially the security side. The bulk of that 30% actually is wages and salaries. It's nothing more than that, to be honest with you. I mean, it just simply, it is what it is. And that's what really, number-wise, caused everything else to shrink, because this function just simply was not there. So when you bring something in, it's going to really be there at the expense of other arms of government. Agriculture is a good example, as a matter of fact, of work that is very much in evidence. It doesn't really mean that the budget, for agriculture was not adequate, because sometimes also here it bears some clarification. A lot of what the government has to do in the agriculture sphere goes to the very heart of what you really are talking about, which is to make it possible for another farmer and another farmer, another day, stick around a day longer, follow highest form of resistance. And part of what the PA did was to really actually invest in infrastructure projects. I'm happy to tell you, especially proud to tell you, good number of them, the heart of Area C, some of them behind the wall. It is not true that there is nothing we can do as an act of defiance and take it as a very complete Area C and not Area C. Like, for example, rehabilitation of artesian water wells. Clearly we could not dig new ones, because that requires a permit from Israeli authorities if it's an Area C. That's agreement, right? But there's nothing to say that anyone can prevent us from rehabilitating existing wells. See, when you are confronted with a challenge, Israeli occupation or less, that is designed to disempower in all of its facets. Its control regime is highly capricious by design to disempower. I mean, you really have to be resourceful and look for ways in which you can defy in order to be able to stick around there longer until they are followed, until we get where we really wanted to get. So we started actually rehabilitating those wells at the very low cost of $40,000, $50,000, $60,000. in the process expanding the capacity of existing wells from 30% of original capacity back to where they were before. And all of a sudden you saw some land reclamation beginning to take place, including in Area C, because people started to see more water coming in, found ways to really actually work with owners of those wells, because there's the paradox, or if you will, the moral hazard associated with the government giving money to well owners, but made deals in order for them to really make it available to farmers at low prices and the rest of it. So there were things that we did on the project side, that it's not, people look at Minister of Agriculture, it's a small regulatory agency. I mean, the government is not in the business of farming or exporting or doing any of this. Agriculture in Palestine is private. I mean, people really do it themselves. It's a question of doing this oversight, but importantly investing in infrastructure. There was a lot of that. Some 800 projects, to be exact, actually were implemented, the heart of everything. I'm especially, happy about this. A lot less than what is needed, but a very good example of what can be summoned by way of will to exist and to resist every day, to really actually do this. Running risk that materialize often of those things being demolished immediately upon you completing them. But what did we do? We rebuilt them every time. There are many examples of this that really exist. The heart of West Bank, including roads, and we as a matter of fact targeted deliberately areas that were close to settlements, where there's water, for example, where you see some activity that by experience we knew was kind of the beginning of more settlement activity, including roads that were destroyed many times. One of them in particular, the heart of West Bank, near Sanfi, in a little village called Salam Fayyad, it still stands today. After having been destroyed many times, it still stands today. So there is that. But so I thought to clarify the question about security and all functions of the Palestinian Authority, very much in line with what we both are saying, need to be re-examined with a view to ensuring that actually it's an instrument of empowerment in the fullest sense of the word. Beginning with directing all attention toward really beginning this act of reunification in a very serious way. That's a very important first step toward that. I think that's what I really wanted to say about these issues. Is there something else you? Oh, by the way, yeah. What I really wanted to say.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah. Just one last thing about
conversation continues
about elections and convening and all. That act of convening is important. So we need something beyond. It's a first step. You need to get going. We need to convene, and the president has that convening power. We should encourage him in any way that is conceivable possible to really actually exercise that convening power toward that end. I didn't say elections immediately. In fact, I discredited calls for elections and free of
I wasn't responding to you.
I know. But elections, when after a period of time, precisely to do exactly what you really talked about, which is open the political space, ensure that young people find a way to express themselves and express their talent and to really act and to mobilize and do all of those things without fear or risk of retribution.
We have one final question, or it would be two, but I urge you only for 2 minutes maximum for one question.
Oh, because we have proven ourselves to be short on words.
We have actually to leave the room by 3:45. So 2 quick questions.
We don't own the room.
Can you take the questions at the same time, Mohammed?
No, we'll take 2 questions.
That's all.
Thank you both for being here. My name is Dina Hanania and I'm a Palestinian student studying for my master's in conflict resolution here. We spoke a lot about the role of Palestinian youth in leadership, and I was wondering what advice you perhaps have for young Palestinians wanting to immerse themselves in the diplomatic field.
Abraham, good question.
Hi, my name is Avram Reisman. I'm a master's student in the Democracy and Governance program, also a former human rights advocate with Amnesty International. And my question is basically, what should the U.S. do in hopefully under a future administration? Like, imagine Bernie Sanders is the president in 2021. What should he do to support the Palestinian struggle?
2 quick questions.
Super quick. So I'll let me answer Dina's question first, which I'm really excited about. Thank you. I meet folks like you all the time. So talented. You are the engine of everything that's happening in the United States. Yesterday, NYU faculty and students just passed a resolution of non-cooperation with Tel Aviv University, not as part of boycott of Tel Aviv University, but as part of compliance with NYU's own principles, because they say that their Palestinian students can't go there. They're denied entry. So in order to comply with the non-discrimination commitment that NYU must keep, they have therefore said non-cooperation. Now that work, and the work that we're seeing, which is the most exciting across the United States, including the UC system, at the trustee level, passing a resolution to divest, including what we see at Columbia University, the collaboration between Black Student Union and the Students for Justice in Palestine to cut ties with G4S to divest from the security company that's used in Israeli prisons and US private prisons. All of this is student-led. And we should not underestimate the role of students in actually changing how it is that we've come to think about the question of Palestine. Scholar Alex Lubin has a wonderful article documenting this in the American Quarterly, which I suggest you read. You're part of that core. You're already part, as far as I'm concerned, a diplomatic core of changing how we think about this and how the world thinks about this. So I applaud all students here for doing that work. In terms of how to enter the diplomatic corps, I don't know. That hasn't, at some point as a younger person, that was definitely an ambition, and I have a dream of being able to actually do this work, to represent this issue, to be on the international field, to be able to put into action things that I envision of what needs to happen in terms of full court press for resistance and what that would look like. The impediment to my participation is that I can't do it in good conscience at this stage with our representative, with our leadership as it is, because unfortunately the participation in actually what I understood last summer was cutting of salaries to Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, which was actually limiting gas to the Gaza Strip. PA is part of the siege, and so that makes it difficult for me to then represent our government on an international level. But I wish, maybe Mabarak, if that's the advice, but I think that you can do this work as a representative without entering that core. In terms of the next administration, my best advice of what the United States can do is get out of the way. Get out of the way. We have been saying it for decades. The US is not a bystander. We as taxpayers are not just in solidarity, we are part of the problem. Israel, as a result of the amount of aid that we give it, and not under the Trump administration, but under the Obama administration, which increased its aid from $3 billion a year over a 10-year period to $3.8 billion a year over a 10-year period, is actually what enables Israel to be I think it has an economy that's between, you might know this better, somewhere between number 23 and 27, strongest economy in the world. We subsidize that. We subsidize that. That's how they can continue to build settlements and provide subsidy to settlers to live there, to make it economically alluring for them. So I think that the best, and we provide unequivocal military aid, and we provide unequivocal diplomatic aid. The Obama administration used its first veto to veto a settlement resolution that verbatim mirrored US foreign policy on settlements. So in my estimation, educated estimation, the US is part of the problem. And the best thing that it could do is to get out of the way, to allow this to be resolved as an international issue and not as a bilateral issue that the US oversees.
Yeah, if I may compliment this from point of view of someone who really actually had the opportunity to serve in public service, public office, and without ever having planned for that or anything like that, or trying to take any credit for it. It was a product. It's interesting you're asking the question, what do I need to do to do this? For me, it was a product of happenstance completely. I mean, I just happened to be there. I wanted to be there. After my service with the IMF, I wanted to stay home, so I left the IMF and was a banker, by the way. That's how I know about banks a little bit more. but only for 4 months. When I was asked to join the PA, I really didn't think much about it. And I joined, and obviously not for the glamour of it. My way of saying, for any and all of you, as a matter of fact, there is no higher honor than to do public service. No higher honor. I mean, I consider it a real privilege of my life to really have had the opportunity to serve. I tried to do the best I could, and never mind that you go in there with your own values, and go in there with what you think is right, and you try to effect change by being there. You run up against the wall, and if it is really too high, insurmountable, there's always an exit sign. I think that's really a good way of thinking about it. I mean, it's not ideal, it's not perfect. I mean, obviously the whole thing is far from ideal. You're operating under a system that's completely under the control of the occupying power to begin with, and then on top of it you add our own shenanigans and the rest of it. It's not perfect, but to be in a position to at least to try to be of value to people around you, people. Anywhere in the world is great. For that to really be something that has something to do with enabling our people to, at long last, get to the point where we are free, there can be no higher honor. So if you have that disposition, I really encourage you wholeheartedly to do. It's not going to be easy, and you're going to really feel lonely at times. There are things that you may not like, and if you don't like them enough, and with no possible change, there's no exit sign soon. You can exercise that option, but try.
It was a marathon for 1 hour and a half. That was really challenging just to be here and trying to moderate a discussion with Professor Erakat and Mr. Fayyad. That was really challenging, but both of you brought very, very interesting perspectives about Palestinian people who are not really sharing that similar views as it seems from outside. So I'm glad that we're capable of giving you more perspective and inside look into what's the whole situation from inside. And thank you for being here with us, with the Middle East and North Africa Forum. We thank also our own partners, the Institute for the Palestinian Studies. They did a great job. And please round of applause for our own great panelists. We have another commitment in the room, so we actually